Okay, when he looks at these non-Occidental societies, of course, there's a lot of different types of societies. But because he examines their internal social structures to such a great extent, he's looking at not just the way that capitalism penetrates, and in a lot of these cases, we're talking more about what might be called the formal rather than the real subsumption of labor power under capitalism. You're not talking about large-scale factory production and things like that in places like India, like exists today, but putting the land tenure relations under a capitalist market type basis has happened in India in the late 18th century and early 19th century, actually. So, yeah, there's why is it multilinear? Because in the Communist Manifesto, he strongly suggests that every society has to see its traditional structures wiped out, and then workers forced into becoming wage laborers, and then creating a new type of solidarity, new type of consciousness, and then moving to democracy and then to communism. But at the end of his life, he switches that around. Because he writes the primitive accumulation section of Capital in 1867, but he continues that all through the 70s because he's continuing to work on that until 1875. And so what he does there is people interpreted that as saying a repeat of the Communist Manifesto, that what England went through, everyone's going to have to go through. Places like India or Russia are just 100 or 200 years behind where we are. And that's what the socialists who followed Marx all thought. But Marx himself actually thought differently. Marx himself thought that Capital described Western Europe and North America, the book Capital, but it did not describe what was going to happen in the rest of the world. That was one possibility for the rest of the world, but that's all it was. And in the early Marx, he's kind of like, well, there are these guild structures and so on that the workers had in the traditional medieval production that gave them a certain kind of solidarity, a certain kind of power. But those have to be destroyed. People have to go through wage labor and then reconstitute themselves as a working class. Now he's saying that certain aspects of those older social solidarities could be a building block for a modern form of communism and socialism. So indigeneity and some of those kinds of things that we talk about today are there. So it's a multilinear pathway to social development and to revolution. As far as slavery and the reproduction of the capitalist mode of production, it's tricky because on the one hand, slavery is there from the first decades of capitalism. If you want to date capitalism from around the time of Columbus's voyage, that merchant or commercial capitalism, mercantile capitalism, then it's already there. The slave plantations are in a way the most advanced form of capitalism for its first century. And I think we forget just how modern these were, even down to the 19th century, the sugar plantations because the slave plantations did not only gathering the sugar, but they refined the sugar into molasses. They did the whole thing right there with enslaved labor. And even as late as the Civil War in the 1860s, he postulates one possibility is that the South would win and they'd extend slavery even further, and they'd extend it to the white immigrant, parts of the white immigrant population from Europe, and form a slavery type capitalism. On the other hand, the full development of capitalism, the fullest development, as in Britain, occurs with this formally free wage labor, which gives labor and gives capital a lot more flexibility. So, but it's really, it isn't a clear-cut thing with him that like slavery is something that holds back capitalist development. That's the modernization school. Marx is, he sees a lot of these things as coexisting, even into the supposedly later period. Yeah, okay, and this thing of the capitalist slavery, when he talks about that quote I have there, that slavery under capitalism is the worst form of slavery ever in history, because it combines the kind of thing that Marx and Max Weber talked about in terms of just this intense surveillance of labor force with artificial lighting and so forth. You can keep people working later and all those kinds of things. Fewer religious holidays. So all the things that come along with modernity, and then combine it with a very ancient form of production, slavery, you get something that, so he reports that in Cuba, they calculated that the slaves would only last 10 years, but that was okay because they could import more. So it's a capitalist slavery. It's a particular form of slavery. It is involved in value creation. There are other ways of producing value. And of course, Marx probably thought that although slavery still existed in Brazil at the time of his, even up to the end of his life, in most places in the world, formal chattel slavery had disappeared. But I don't think he anticipated that people like Hitler would have reinstituted slave labor as they did, and it worked for it. They were able to produce pretty advanced missiles using slave labor. I mean, so slavery and modernity, I think, is a very open question. What Marx doesn't talk, he talks about race. He doesn't talk about race and slavery in the sense of the racialized element of the slave production and the mentality that creates in the slave master and the enslaved people based on that specific form of production. That's, of course, what somebody like Frantz Fanon later on, basing himself to some extent on Marx, talks about. And one last thing on slavery, though it's not directly answering your question. One of the reasons Marx thought the Civil War was such a gigantic revolution was because the monetary value of the enslaved people in the United States was greater than all the landed property in the United States in 1860. So when slavery was abolished without compensation, that was the greatest expropriation of private property since the French Revolution kicked the aristocracy off its estates and divided the land among the peasants. It was way more radical, even in economic terms, than anything that happened since the French Revolution. That aspect of the abolition of slavery in the United States is under-discussed and under-theorized.